Hi, this is Dr. Georgia. I hope you find today's message a blessing in your life. We want to make sure that we continue to provide these video messages for you when you can't come to church, or for those of you who live in a different state, or we noticed recently we have a lot of people in even different countries who are tuning in. So if that is you and you can donate to us, we invite you to hit that donate button just below the message here. So thanks so much. Well, you're in for a treat. Somebody cleaned up his bio while you were all meditating, so I don't have it, but I'm going to just tell you that this morning I had a little breakthrough in my life because of what he said. And I suspect that each one of you can have some sort of a shift in your lives because of what he's talking about, the whole subject of being called to a greater expression of who it is we are. His name is Gregg Levoy. And he comes to us as quite a career. He was a reporter for the newspaper USA Today, as well as he's been on PBS and CBS and NPR and a number of other television stations, kind of sharing a beautiful message. So I'm going to let him tell more about himself, but please join with me in welcoming Mr. Gregg Levoy.
All right. Good morning. Good morning. You guys are a rockin' bunch. All right, I think we'll jump right in. When I was in college, I learned a critical lesson about human nature, and a lesson that has everything to do with the work that I do today. And it was in a psychology class. And what we did is we pulled a prank on the professor in mid-semester. And it was based on what he was teaching us at that point, which is called classical conditioning. All right? So most people know about this through the experiment using the famous Pavlov's dogs. Ring a bell? See if you're on your toes. They were taught to salivate at the sound of a ringing bell. So, and I discovered recently that Pavlov's dogs is also the name of a perfume, which I think has very interesting implications for the menfolk. So this is what we did. We took advantage of the professor's habit of pacing back and forth in front of the lecture hall when he delivered his lectures. So whenever he paced over toward the windows, what we did is we very subtly pretended to be bored. All right? So we slouched and we fidgeted and we doodled and we stared vacuously to outer space, which actually by mid-semester it turned out some of us were already pretty accomplished at. And whenever he paced over toward the door, what we did, again, almost imperceptibly, is we now pretended to be interested. Okay? So we sat up a little bit straighter and we started taking notes, fixing him with keen scholarly expressions. By the time that day's class was over, we had our psychology professor glued to the door. It was singularly the highlight of my college years. And I half expected that when the bell rang at the end of class, he would begin to visibly salivate. He denied us that pleasure. But what I saw was how incredibly easy it is to condition a human being. All right, to steer them from the outside. And by extension, of course, to be conditioned. And without a word being spoken. The whole thing was done in pantomime. And I figured if it took us, 50 minutes to condition our psychology professor with a whole new set of behaviors, a new direction in life, if you will. I tried to imagine the effect on me of a lifetime's worth of that kind of conditioning by the time I was 18. I mean, thousands upon thousands of messages that every one of us got while we were growing up, okay? Spoken and unspoken. And that effectively instructed us in the rules of the game. You know, what dreams are and are not bankable. What is and isn't possible. How are you supposed to behave in public? What's the reigning definition of success? Right? What are you personally capable of? Just, you know what I'm saying? Who pulls the strings in this game and who dances? And I think the cumulative effect of a lifetime's worth of that kind of conditioning forms effectively a kind of hypnosis. It's a kind of hypnosis. And I don't think it even matters whether the messages you get are negative or positive or false or true. Right? It's a kind of hypnosis. And, you know, every kind of human community passes along the message, from families to corporations and churches and gender and society at large, passes along the message that conformity is rewarded and failure to conform is punished. It's really just a holdover from natural law, because what natural law tells us is those who lead the herd to go their merry way have a tendency to get eaten. Okay? It's a little bit more complicated in the human arena, but I think the warning stands. You know, and even though culture itself wouldn't exist without the glue of conformity to some degree, I just think that the individuals in it can pay a pretty steep price for it. And one of the prices we can pay is losing a working familiarity with who we really are. Okay? So when I think of the notion of a calling, I think that a calling cuts through a lot of this kind of conditioning because it emanates from the part of each one of us that knows what it knows. All right? The part of each one of us that knows where other people leave off and where we begin. And at a really early age. I've got a friend here in the Bay Area who once told me that she had an interaction with her 5-year-old daughter, Janaea, who apparently wanted to do something mommy did not think advisable. And so she said, Janaea, honey, I wouldn't do that if I were you. To which Janaea replied, with absolute innocence and certainty. You know? So we know where that line is. Calls emanate from the part of us that knows the feel of integrity in our lives and the feel of its absence. Right? And I don't mean integrity as a moral issue. I actually mean it as a psychological issue, as in being in integrity with yourself. Right? And calls come from the part of us that knows what kind of decisions it's going to take to stay true to true north. And if not true to the developmental imperatives of our lives. In other words, the fact that they change. And so will the calls that come through the being that's being changed. Okay? So, and by the way, I'm defining a call really broadly. Secularly, pluralistically. They're just the signals and the signs and the messages and the urgings and the promptings that come from deep inside your life that tell you what it's going to take to make your life literally come true. Okay? So I'm defining it really broadly. Now, the kind of authenticity that I'm talking about, I mean, the Callings book is titled Finding and Following an Authentic Life. So what I mean by that is, this kind of life is not something I think people need to discover, go on a pilgrimage to figure out, as much as I think it's something people need to remember. Remember. Religion. Both mean exactly the same thing, and that's to rebond, to reconnect. Okay? So, I ran across a college biology textbook some years ago. In fact, when I was researching the book. And there was a passage in there that jumped out at me. And it was a description of what happens in a fertilized human egg, okay, as it's growing and developing. And so what they described is that as the cells grow and develop, really early on in that process, these little indentations appear in the cell ball that begin the process of distinguishing one side of you from the other, the head from the hindquarters, okay? a distinction that seems to be lost entirely on some people. 40 years after they're fertilized. In any case, what it described is that at this point in the game, if you were to take a cell from the head and mechanically move it down to the hindquarters, what would happen is that it would migrate right back up. And this is what the book said. It knows what it's supposed to become. And you can imagine how that would strike me doing research on a book about following your authenticity and your callings. So what I took from that is we know what we're supposed to become. You know, at a cellular level, we know what we're supposed to become. Individually as well as perhaps collectively. And in fact, nowadays when I hear people use this kind of language, I feel it in my guts, I feel it in my cells, I feel it in my bones, I feel it in the very fiber of my being. Anymore, I think they're talking literally. You know, so I was really struck by that. And one of the people that I included in the Callings book was a guy who lives down in Santa Cruz. His name is Howard Ikamoto. He's an artist. And he describes an interaction that he had one day with his 7-year-old daughter who came to him and asked him, "Daddy, what do you do at work?" And he said, "Well, I work at the college and my job is to teach people how to draw." And he said that she looked back at him incredulous and said, "Daddy, you mean they forget?" Imagine how that would seem to a 7-year-old kid. That you could possibly forget how to draw. You know, it's like forgetting how to dream or something. So, when I was interviewing people for the Callings book, one of the things that jumped out at me in that series of interviews was how many of those people told me that they had a practice of some kind, all right? And the whole purpose of this practice was to strike up a conversation with the deep self, all right? So a self-reflective practice. I was really impressed by how many of these people, and these are the types who are really receptive and responsive to their life, okay? Have a self-reflective practice of some kind. And nothing extravagant. Daily journaling, really common. For some people, therapy is a self-reflective practice. Artwork done in the service of self-discovery. Dream interpretation, regular short retreats, regular intimate conversation as a practice. And I would say your participation in any kind of group whose members get together for the primary purpose of waking up. Okay? Women's groups, men's groups, mastermind groups, spiritual groups, personal boards of advisors, even 12-step groups. Is a complete non sequitur. The book I did after Callings is called Vital Signs. It's a book about passion. One of the chapters in there, I addressed the subject of talkaholism. Okay? I'll take that murmur as a sign that you've run into this before. Okay. One of the guys that I interviewed for that chapter swore that there's a 12-step group for talkaholics, and he said it's called On and On Anonymous. I just thought that was hysterical. So, one of the things that these kind of dialoguing practices can help you do is, well, first of all, avoid what the mythologist Joseph Campbell called the great sacrilege in terms of the soul's integrity, which is what he called inadvertence. Inadvertence. In other words, not paying attention. Bumbling along, stumbling along, not having the receivers turned on. Okay? So having a self-reflective practice can help you avoid that fate, but can also remind you that there's not just one calling in there. All right? Contrary to what some people learn in, say, Catholic school, about there being one singular vocation per person, per lifetime, and your job is to figure this out before the curtain comes down or something. How many of you guys have a sense right now in your life that you have more than one thing calling to you? Does that sound familiar? Yeah, because there's vocational calls, but there's also relationship calls, aren't there? and lifestyle calls, moral calls, spiritual calls, service calls, the ones you got when you were 20. Aren't they really different than the ones you're getting at 40? Different than the ones you get at 75? I mean, there is that developmental arc, all right? I want to share with you some of the channels through which calls come to us, okay? Because they come in a very impressive variety of forms. And I once heard a poet named Wallace Stevens say, "I don't ask for the full ringing of the bell. I don't ask for a clap of thunder. A scrawny cry will do." And I love that approach to the discernment of calls, all right? Because they come as passions, they come as gifts, they come as intuitions. An intuition is a small calling, right? They come as dreams. All the religions of the world seem to agree on this. Dreams, one of the primary channels through which the gods and the goddesses talk to the mortals, okay? Who was it? Tom Robbins, the author Tom Robbins, another roadside attraction, even cowgirls get the blues. He said, dreams don't come true. They are true. When we talk about our dreams coming true, we're actually talking about our ambitions. All right? And I ran across a stunning corroboration of that idea out of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. They did a study of pregnant women, and they found that of the women who had an intuition about the gender of their baby, they were correct 71% of the time, which I thought was impressive all by itself. However, of the women who had a dream about the gender of their baby, those women were correct 100% of the time. It's a Johns Hopkins study. I mean, what does that say? You know, we've got access to really deep knowledge in there and we're sleeping through it. Really deep knowledge. Real information, real data, real consequences if ignored, in my opinion. Another one is, where is there friction in your life? Calls come through that. Where is there friction? It's like in the natural world. Friction occurs where changes are trying to take place, or are taking place. All right? Where does walk not quite match talk? Where does head argue with heart all the time? Where do you fight with people? What are you fighting for? You know what I'm saying? Where does passion rub up against security? One of the primary dramas in people's relationship to their callings. There's information in there. Calls come through a decision that needs to be made in your life now, not backburnered another 6 months or another 10 years, right? Some issue that's hanging over your head waiting for resolution, in other words, all right? Calls come through, and this is the level at which I encourage people, and will encourage you in the workshop this afternoon if you come, to look at this material. Calls come through things like song lyrics you can't get out of your head for weeks. Any of you guys familiar with a novelist named Ann Tyler? She wrote The Accidental Tourist. This was made into a movie with William Hurt. And she's a brilliant observer of the dynamics between partners, couples, right? She says, I can always tell what my husband is really thinking by the tunes that he absent-mindedly hums in the car. So, you know, guys, like, I'm in the mood for love is really different than tied to the whipping post. Just saying. You know, really different. So, take note. All right? And they definitely come through the body. I've got a whole chapter called The Language of the Body because the word symptom means a sign. The word symptom means a sign of what? The word pathology means the logic of pain. What's the logic? Right? I interviewed a guy for both of my books named Arnold Mindell. He started something called process-oriented psychology. And he is a brilliant body-mind guy. And he said at one point to me, symptoms are usually dreams trying to come true. Yeah, I'd never heard of anything like that either. Symptoms are usually dreams trying to come true. We're going to look at that among many other questions in the workshop. But right after that interview, I got a little object lesson in the truth of that statement when I went to do a presentation at a writers' conference in Albuquerque. After my presentation, I'm out of the lobby, I'm chatting with people, that sort of thing, signing books. This woman walks up to me out of the crowd, complete stranger to me, walks up to me and says, one of those things that people won't typically say to you unless they're pretty sure they're never going to see you again. She walks right up to me and goes, hey, you know, I'm so fat, which is not a question you're supposed to answer. And besides, before I could even wrap my brain around the question, she answered it. She said, it's because I have so many stories inside of me I'm not writing down. I know. And I'll tell you, there is no science or philosophy I know of that could dispute a self-diagnosis delivered with that kind of certainty. Woman knew her body was trying to tell her something. She apparently knew exactly what it was. I need to be writing. She knew her symptom in the sense that it was a sign, meant something. And she knew exactly what it was. It was, frankly, it was the mark of Jonah. It was the mark of Jonah. It was the evidence of her flight from a calling. And one, in this case, as she put it, this is her language, that's literally pushing out from inside of me. That's how she languaged it. So, one more thing and then I'll draw it to a close. So I used to be a reporter for, among other papers, the Cincinnati Enquirer, and back in my 20s. And one of my favorite stories that I wrote in all the years that I was in the paper was a story of the circus coming to town. This is Ringling Brothers, back when they existed. And I went down to the train tracks because that's how they traveled around the country. And in a fit of journalistic zeal, and therefore short-sightedness, I let the animal trainer of Ringling Brothers convince me that riding bareback on an elephant at the head of the Barnum and Bailey Circus Parade through downtown would add color to my story. So, contrary to my Jungle Book fantasies about how I was actually going to get up on the elephant, which was being airlifted on its trunk, this is actually how I thought it was going to happen. The only way to get up there was to use a ladder. Okay, and the only way to stay up there during the parade was to hang on to the elephant's ears. Okay? Now, those of you who have ridden bareback on elephants, you probably know about this already, but elephant ears have this really unpleasant habit of flapping a lot, especially when they're hot, and it was high summer, and we're talking elephant ear flaps here. You know, this is not like kitty cat twitches. You know? And so the only way to stay up there during the parade was to remain extremely flappable. Really. Otherwise, I'd have been thrown, and it was 15 feet to the ground. A concern that, to be honest, paled in comparison to my concern about how stupid I looked up there. Because, for one thing, I'm wearing my business clothes. He sprung this on me at the last minute, and I couldn't resist. I was young and foolish. And so I'm wearing my business clothes, and my pants are scrunched up above my knees with the black socks. It was just a fashion tragedy. But when I look back on that experience and what I have learned since then about what's involved in following a calling, that experience has a lot in common with it. In that, I was caught by surprise and carried off by something way bigger than me. Right? It was nerve-wracking and thrilling simultaneously, and in that the elephant couldn't have cared less. I'll tell you what I mean by that. I've discovered this really unsettling truth. My soul doesn't seem to care what price I have to pay to follow my calls. I hate this. It seems like a design flaw to me. And I say that with all humility. But, you know, it's like it doesn't care. My happiness, my security, my popularity, my vanity doesn't seem to matter to it. It's It's not interested in whether I live a comfortable life. It's not interested in whether I get rich and famous. It doesn't care whether people even like me or not. But what does seem to matter is hanging on to the elephant. That does seem to matter. The willingness to go for the ride that is your ride to take, but the willingness to go for the big ride. I mean the one that ensures that someday, if your life happens to be flashing in front of your eyes, at the very least, it will hold your interest. That much at least. So, in the spirit of helping to ensure that it does, I just want to say that the workshop this afternoon is a very hands-on opportunity to explore whatever your life is calling for from you. This is not lecture format, this is participatory, all right? I'm going to ask you a ton of nosy questions to help you generate a little body of data to take home that'll give you a snapshot of what your life is calling for from you. So I hope you'll come. And once again, thank you so much, Dr. Gregg, for inviting me. Thank you.